Welcome back into the Lions247 Podcast as we roll our way through mid-January now. The second week of the semester is here. The freshmen and the newly enrolled transfer players starting to get settled in here at Penn State. We're starting to get settled into the idea of what this 2024 Penn State football roster is going to be looking like, at least through the spring semester and spring practices, which will start in mid-March. And we're going to wrap our heads around some position rooms that are in the spotlight, we believe, now in these upcoming months as Penn State bridges the gap between reassembling its roster here in January 2024 and then buckling up and really getting after it for preseason camp in August. We'll review a few spots in the field that have been directly impacted by recent additions through the transfer class, through the freshman class, and also impacted by departures, whether it's for the NFL draft or just no more eligibility or guys entering the portal, which hasn't happened a lot. We'll dive into that with Daniel Gallen in just a moment, who's also going to share some perspective on Penn State basketball. He was at the BJC on Tuesday night as the Nittany Lions upset 11th-ranked Wisconsin. Back to 500 are the Penn State basketball Nittany Lions, and they have a really interesting roller coaster of sorts thus far in conference play. We'll talk about that, and we'll finish up this episode with Tyler Calvaruso. Not only is there a lot to dissect with him about this early enrolled class that we dove into a lot with Brian Doan on the last episode of this podcast last week. And again, if you missed that one, it dropped last Thursday, January 11th. It had Brian Doan breaking down just about every member of this early enrolled group in January. We're going to pick Tyler's brain on a few things. He's going to talk about a few guys that have been off the beaten path a little bit, maybe not necessarily in the spotlight as much as others. And we'll wrap with a look ahead at what shapes up to be a relatively big weekend for Penn State football recruiting. Junior Day here on campus set for Saturday. You've got a lot of really intriguing prospects from that 2025 class making their way from in the region and from beyond the region. We'll talk about several of them and start to set the stage with Tyler Calvaruso. But as I mentioned before, we've got Daniel Gallen to kick things off here on this episode. And Daniel, I said we're going to talk a lot about the roster, but we really have to begin with the staff changes because since we last spoke here on the podcast, there has been some movement at another coordinator position. There's been some analyst movement as well, which may not seem as big on the surface, but can really be a key component of what a staff accomplishes day by day. Let's begin with the bigger news of the bunch, and that's Stacey Collins going back to Boise State. That one broke late last week. He came from Boise State to come to Penn State a couple of years ago, spent 2 years as a special teams coordinator. It was also the outside linebackers and nickels coach for the Penn State defense. We saw him on the practice field working in coordination with Manny Diaz often with those linebackers, but his bread and butter has been that special teams coordinator position. He goes back to Boise. He'll wear that title. He also gets a bit of a bump in becoming an all-out linebackers coach for the Broncos, and he's also the assistant head coach out there. He's got his roots, Daniel, when you look at his coaching record, his career as a player, which was out at West Oregon. He's got a lot of roots in that region. So not surprised to see him pounce on this opportunity. And Penn State, as you wrote about, as it went official on Wednesday, and then on Monday night, as it was reported by 247 Sports, Matt Zanitz, that they've got a new coordinator in town already. We're going to have a 2-week high-profile search here. Let's face it, special teams coordinator is never going to be the headline stealer that offensive and defensive coordinator was for the Nittany Lions in the recent months. But let's talk about the new hire. You wrote about him, introduced him to the world.
Yeah, Justin Lustig from Vanderbilt. I think that when you kind of compare it to Stacey Collins, there's almost like an inverse there, where when Stacey Collins came to Penn State 2 years ago, I believe it was his first time coaching east of the Mississippi. His entire background was out in the West. We saw some of those connections kind of come through when Vanga Ioane signed in that class 2 years ago. It was kind of something a little different, some geographic diversity for Penn State. And now with Justin Lustig coming from Vanderbilt, you have an Erie native who went to Cathedral Prep, the same school that produced Juice Scruggs, and some other people who have come through the Penn State program in recent years, played 4 years at Bucknell, and then spent a year as a head coach at Edinburgh, also has experience at Villanova. So there's a lot of Pennsylvania roots there. You're bringing a Pennsylvania guy home. We know kind of what Penn State means to people from Pennsylvania. We know how James Franklin has not necessarily leveraged, but he uses the connections that people have, whether it's Letterman coming back whether it's people who have connections to the area, even you look at some of the past coordinators. Mike Yursich worked in the PSAC. Kirk Shiraka is from Pennsylvania. Like the connections kind of shine through here, but you're getting someone in Justin Lustig who has a very extensive experience. In FBS, he spent a lot of time at Vanderbilt, a lot of time at Syracuse. Along the way, he accumulated some of those titles, like we talked about with Stacey Collins. He's been an assistant head coach. He's been an associate head coach. He's someone that Penn State has had on their radar, going back to the search that landed up Stacey Collins 2 years ago. So it seems like that, on paper, it seems like a very good fit. He's going to coach those outside linebackers and those nickels too. He has experience coaching defensive backs. He has experience coaching tight ends, running backs. He had the outside receivers coach title at Syracuse. These special teams coordinators, the way that college football kind of works, you have to be a little bit of a jack of all trades because of how the responsibilities are split up. But I think that there was maybe some thought when Stacey Collins left that, okay, let's split up special teams duties between some different coaches. Let's get another full-time position coach, whether that's a quarterback's coach or something else. But we know how much James Franklin really values special teams and the emphasis that he's put in the investment when you look at scholarship usage and just overall roster usage, who they've pursued in the transfer portal. So I think that this is very fitting in line with how Penn State has approached things. And, by all accounts, looks like they made a very solid hire.
Yeah, and then Lustig appeared, but by what we gathered, to benefit from Penn State's pursuit of him a couple of years ago. He got a new title added to his to his resume, I guess you could say, at Vanderbilt, and that came with a pay bump. I have no doubt about that. And then Penn State needs another coordinator a couple of years later as Stacey Collins moves on. They go back to that list. He's still the name near the top of it. They get it done this time. And so Stacey Collins, what we talked about, the same kind of role. This isn't a guy who's going to be kind of adding a new dimension to the staff, what he's working with based on what the releases from Penn State. The outside linebackers work, the nickel work, and then also what he's going to be doing as a special teams coordinator. But what this does show you, and you talked about it, he's a utility piece, a guy that maybe could chime in from a different perspective. And I know it's at the Division II level, but James Franklin has gone on the record a few times in recent months discussing the value that he is placing on head coaching experience for guys. And that doesn't mean all of them are going to have Power 5 coaching experience like Manny Diaz did coming to town after his time with Miami. But with Division II Edinburgh, you saw him take a team, what were they, 0-11 the year before he got there, and they ended up being a 9-win team during his time there at the Division II. So he's proven it in a few different capacities, wearing a few different hats. So I think it's good to get this guy in the building based on what he's accomplished as a special teams coordinator. And I believe tight ends were the focus during his time at Vanderbilt. So a little bit of an adjustment there. We also know that tight ends were the focus for Andy Kotelnicki during his time at Kansas. So you got some guys kind of adjusting to different roles in their careers right now with Penn State. But James Franklin clearly sees a fit. And I think this is the kind of guy, when you talk about the background as a player at Bucknell, about an hour away, as a head coach at the Division II level, at the high school level, and just the roots that he's established here in the state of Pennsylvania, seems like somebody who's just good to get inside your building, underneath your roof, because you never know what staff changes may be needed next year, the following year. And unlike the recent special teams coordinator, this guy doesn't feel like he's going to be looking to another region based on family and based on background. And with Joe Lorig, even before Stacey Collins, you both got the sense, both kind of gave you the sense that they were ultimately going to circle back and get out west. And here you got a guy who may be content to be sticking at Penn State for a while, and there may be opportunities and avenues for him to grow into different roles during his time in Happy Valley if things are going successfully for him and for his unit.
Definitely. I think that this is a move that you can kind of project out to the long term a little bit. I think when it comes to staff turnover and everything, kind of nothing surprises you at this point. There's so much movement all the time for a variety of reasons. But we've seen James Franklin do a nice job of retaining his assistants. and kind of constructing a really core of his coaching staff. And I think when you look at Lustig coming in, I mean, I think it fits very, very nicely. I am kind of curious to know kind of what he's someone where you want to ask kind of what his aspirations are, because he has that head coaching experience at the lower level. He's worked in the ACC, he's worked in the SEC, he's about to work in the Big Ten. I think that you've seen a special teams coordinator, and having these other responsibilities, you really have your hands in a lot of different areas. And I think that you've seen it with some coaches in the NFL, like John Harbaugh, having that background. It's something that can be conducive there. So he walks into, I think, a pretty interesting situation in terms of the investment that's been made and the players that he's going to be coaching and some of the competitions he's going to be overseeing. But I think overall, this is a move that, barring something unforeseen, you can kind of project it out a little bit longer term than, maybe you could do with Stacey Collins, maybe than you could do with Joe Lorig.
Yeah, and you look at the track record here a little bit. He was a Broyles Award nominee back in 2018. Back then, he was on Syracuse's staff as a special teams coordinator. He also had the Lou Groza Award winner on that squad as the nation's top place kicker. You go up to Vanderbilt, more individual accolades for some of his players. Matthew Hayball, punter, was a finalist for the Ray Guy Award, which goes annually to the top punter across college football. And then we've talked about the consistency at long snapper with Penn State. And then they had the Manley Award winner last year. Wesley Schelling, two-time all-conference selection for Vanderbilt at the long snapper spot. And obviously, you're not going to judge special teams off of just a position or two or three. But there's a few that you're going to spotlight and say, well, if it doesn't go well here, people are going to point to the special teams coordinator, and place kicker is one of them. He's inheriting an interesting situation there. Punter, he's benefiting from a great decision in Penn State's mind by the NCAA to give Riley Thompson 2 more years of eligibility after he performed at an all-conference level. There was a lot of all-conference level punters, as it turned out, in the Big Ten this year, but he projects as one of the top punting returners in Big Ten football. But that place kicker spot from the get is going to be really interesting because he wasn't the catalyst for bringing in the transfer from Tulsa and Chase Mayer, and Stacey Collins was. And he also wasn't involved in handing out a scholarship to Sanders Zahadak, who's going to be in year 4 on campus now in 2024, a guy who was the top-rated kicker by 247 Sports in his class back in 2021. But we have very little to go off of in terms of on-field Saturday track records for Zahadak, and what we have to go off of isn't all that pretty. So before we get to the unit overall, where I think they're good in terms of some leadership that's built in there, especially with Don DeLuca being a 2-time captain here in 2024. But place kicker is really, I think, a spot where you want to get a long look at this as much as possible. And as we've mentioned before, it's not just the transfer, it's not just the incumbent scholarship player, but you've got Ryan Barker, who spent his redshirt year here as a freshman walk-on, turning some heads, and it sounds like he's somebody to monitor in spring practice.
Yeah, looking at special teams, Tyler Duzansky, I think you can consider him entrenched at long snapper. You look at Riley Thompson, I think you can say he's entrenched at punter, especially with Alex Paqueta moving on this offseason. And so you kind of go to that kicker spot. And Penn State, I think, really, really hit gold in the portal with Alex Felkins last year. I think that was someone that they were really able to find at kind of the right time in his career and put him in an environment where he can really thrive. It's going to be hard to, I think, kind of duplicate that with Chase Mayer coming in from Tulsa. He is someone who has a track record of success, but Alex Felkins really, really took a leap last year. So those are some big shoes to fill. And competing with Sanders Zahadak, I mean, I think we all know how much talent Sanders Zahadak has in that left leg. You watch him during warmups, and Alex Felkins would get out to 55, and he told us that was his limit, and you'd see the ball kind of sneak over the upright a little bit, and Sanders Zahadak would line up from 57 and just boom it, still with room to spare. But finding that consistency, trying to nail that down is going to be, I think, one of the more under the radar storylines this offseason, and something that Justin Lustig coming in is going to have to kind of figure out where he's at, where Ryan Barker is at, what Chase Meyer can do, how exactly this is going to fit together. Are they going to go back to kind of the split that they had with Jordan Stout and Jake Pinniger, where everything was so exact as to dialed in at 43 yards was the line. We didn't really see that this past year. I'm curious to see what his philosophy is and how he's going to approach things a little bit. I think also you look at the return spots. That's going to be an interesting competition too, because you lose Daquan Hardy. Caden Saunders is coming back as of now, and he's someone who had that punt returner role at the beginning, but he didn't kind of take that leap. There wasn't that, he's very solid, but there wasn't that dynamic element that you're looking for from him. So what's that going to look like? And then even bigger picture, I think something that is a little bit more under the radar is the coverage teams. How is that going to look? I think that I was thinking about the kickoff coverage team this morning, where that's where a lot of those true freshmen this past year, guys like Elliott Washington, Zion Tracy, Tony Rojas, King Mack, that's kind of where they burn their red shirts. If you project those guys taking on larger roles, that might leave vacancies there. So what's going to be that next level that steps up and takes over those spots? I think that's something else that I'm kind of curious to see how that shakes out. And so I think with special teams, I get kind of caught up in this sometimes too, in terms of just thinking kicker, punter, long snapper. But there's a lot that goes into it. You can have a lot of moving parts. What happens on the defense in terms of guys having different roles, on the offense, guys having different roles, that affects kind of what your job is. There's a lot of management that goes on, and I'm kind of curious to see what this looks like as we go on. And I think some of these things, like kickoff coverage team, we're not going to know that until they line up at West Virginia on August 31st. But we've seen special teams really be a good avenue for some young guys, and Justin Lustig is going to be the guy who gets to work with some of these very, very well-regarded freshmen and get them onto the field right away. So it's a really interesting role. There's a lot going on.
I think those freshmen those freshmen will play a significant role on the practice field when they get special teams work underway this spring. There's no doubt about it. You got 16 early enrollees. Not all of them are going to be out there in special teams coverage, but a big bulk of that group will be, just as we saw in 2023. And that was the initial pathway for most first-year players at Penn State to burn red shirt in 2023. We'll talk about special teams. That'll be a storyline moving forward for Penn State. But all three coordinator spots now filled with new faces. Obviously, going back a ways in November, Penn State parted ways with Mike Yurcich after the Michigan loss. They since replaced him with Andy Kotelnicki, who a couple days after that announcement was declared by 247 Sports as the 2023 Offensive Coordinator of the Year across college football. And then, of course, Manny Diaz, after a fantastic 2-year stretch as defensive coordinator for the Nittany Lions. He's now running his own show down in Durham with Duke. And since then, you've got Tom Allen, who spent almost a decade in the Big Ten East as Indiana's head coach. Before that, Indiana's defensive coordinator. He is now the DC in Happy Valley. So now that we're all caught up, a little bit lower down the totem pole, Daniel, in terms of the staff, but James Franklin likes to have his maximize his opportunities for hires. And that extends to these analyst roles, which have been increasingly important across college football in all three phases of the game. We've got an analyst leaving town. We've got an analyst coming to town, and I should say returning to town in that case. And you have the story up at Lions247 on Tuesday.
Yeah, there's kind of always this under the radar churn a little bit that happens at these analyst positions. I think that it's something that you kind of expect to see. We've seen guys come and go, over these past couple of years as the staff gets bigger. And the latest change is we're seeing Calvin Lowry depart after spending 1 year as an offensive analyst, and Mark Dupuy. I didn't test that last name out before I came out on here.
I believe
But
if memory serves me right, Dupuy.
There we go. He's returning to town after a couple years at Old Dominion with Ricky Ronnie. He's a former Penn State graduate assistant, and he'll kind of fit into that offensive analyst role that was vacated by Lowry. It's our understanding that you'll see Lowry resurface at some point. With an on-field coaching role somewhere. I think that's kind of how these analyst jobs are used by some coaches, where it's kind of a stopover point. When you're in between jobs, you can, collect a salary, make more connections, work on their different guys, work with different guys, provide different value to a program. And then you can kind of take that experience and apply it elsewhere. So I think that it's it's these moves. I don't really view them as a huge deal. I do think Dupuis coming back is interesting because he had success at Old Dominion under Ricky Ronnie. His bio on the Old Dominion website made it clear that he was Ricky Ronnie's first hire when he got that Old Dominion job after the 2019 season. So he's someone who has a wealth of experience working with wide receivers. And I think that when you talk about this wide receiver room, that's something that you're really looking to, I guess, improve and try to boost. Lowry worked with that group last season under Marcus Higgins too. So this is kind of I guess this is going to be kind of the new norm in college football as these analyst staffs get bigger and bigger. Guys kind of coming through for a year or two, getting this experience, moving on. Guys kind of like what we saw with it almost seemed like the plan was going to be with Deion Barnes initially, where you can almost sort of stash some of these guys that you might not necessarily have an on-field place for moving forward. So James Franklin has emphasized these analyst jobs. Right now they have 11 of them listed in the online staff directory. We've known that there's been a couple more in the past, like Ken Wisenhunt was around the team. He was not listed in that online staff directory. So the more bodies that you can have, the more kind of brains you can get into the Lash building, I think is something that James Franklin really wants. And I think that it might be hard to see maybe the explicit benefits or the very clear benefits from the outside, but the fact that James Franklin really keeps emphasizing this, banging this drum, I think kind of shows what kind of resource this has been for him.
Another part of that arms race that Penn State's trying to deal with across college football. It extends to the staff, it extends to the roster, it extends to the financial resources. On and on it goes, and up and up teams build. And just one more note on Dupuis. Part of that Joe Moorhead,
Yes.
coaching movement that we saw take place, where Moorhead had a few guys around him, came to campus with Moorhead after spending time with him back in his previous stop. And so I think it's really interesting here. You've got the ties to Moorhead from Fordham. You've got the ties to Ricky Ronnie going to Old Dominion, and you've got him coming back here, a guy who spent 3 seasons previously working with the Penn State offense. Really like this fit, and he's a guy that we've seen in the past. Daniel, I don't think you have, but we've seen him working the camp circuit in the summers, and I know that Calvin Lowry is a bit of a presence to fill with those prospect camps. So he provides it out there. I think Mark is a guy who's going to step in and fill those shoes pretty nicely, as well as they're working to find the next collection of receiver targets in the 2025, 2026, 2027 classes moving forward. So some interesting stuff going on with the staff. I think things are starting to settle a bit there. Of course, we're seeing the domino effect take place across Power 5 football with some of these head coaching changes dictated by the Nick Saban departure in Tuscaloosa. Still waiting to see if there's any shrapnel from that reaches Happy Valley, and we got to deal with another staff change from that game of dominoes. But for now, let's put our focus over on the changes from a personnel standpoint, Daniel, and just focus on some positions that you feel, based on the what has transpired since the Peach Bowl, what transpired in 2023 during the season, that position is clearly in the spotlight this semester as we work through an evolution of sorts for the entire team. But I think it's really hard to turn away from wide receiver, where the addition has been Julian Fleming. It's one that commanded a lot of headlines. We've discussed it quite a bit here on the podcast. We wrote about it a bunch at Lions247.com. He's now underway with life as an Nittany Lion. To this point, there have been some other pursuits at wide receiver. Tyler Calvaruso has done a good job documenting that on this show. But Julian Fleming is the lone pickup at that position. I think what's more surprising to a lot of us is that Christian Driver, since the end of the regular season, is the lone departure from this position. Everybody else that was on the 2023 roster carrying a scholarship remains on the 2024 roster, and the NFL draft window has closed. The standard transfer portal window has closed, and it's the time of the year where guys start to reset their focus with their teams. And right now, it looks like it's going to be a crowded bunch at receiver as things stand for Marcus Higgins for the spring semester.
Yeah, when you sent over the rundown and I kind of jotted in my notes, I almost felt like I was cheating, putting wide receiver in first and under this kind of prompt. And you just look at it, and given what transpired last year with the lack of production that you got overall, and then with Keandre Lambert-Smith in particular, kind of his nosedive in production at the end of the season, I think that you had a lot of curiosity about how things would shake out. I think in terms of losing only one guy to the transfer portal, you do have to remember that there's going to be another window after spring football, and the way that Penn State has things scheduled, that's going to open on April 16th, which is right after the blue-white game. So I think that we've seen it these past couple of years. There's been a little bit of movement, as soon as you get to the end of spring ball. So it's going to be interesting to see what this competition looks like. I think back to last year when we were hearing from James Franklin, it was Keandre Lambert-Smith, Trey Wallace, and everybody else. And when you're in the spring, it's kind of you're kind of like, there's a long way to go. You have a lot of runway. Omari Evans, maybe sort of moved into that third spot by the end of spring. But by the time you get to the season, that comes quickly, and no one else really stepped up for Penn State. So it's going to be really, I think that competition has the potential to be pretty intense, pretty fierce. I think that these guys, given some of the reactions that we saw on social media after the Peach Bowl, they know what's been said about them. I think they're pretty aware of what the external perception of that room is. I think Marcus Hagans knows what the perception of that room is, and so it's on them. It's on someone to step up, seize an opportunity. There are going to be chances. I mean, I think that with Fleming, Keandre Lambert-Smith, and Trey Wallace, you kind of have your a top three penciled in. But we've heard James Franklin these past 2 and 3 years talking about how he wants to get that top six. He wants to have that two deep. He wants to have that ability to rotate through guys at the different positions, which is something that has never really come to fruition. It seems like we're almost in the same situation as it was with the offensive line, where it's kind of, we don't want to hear about it anymore. We just need to see it, come through on Saturdays. And so it's going to be a big spring for that group. I think that the Julian Fleming addition, as we've talked about these past couple of weeks, is really, really big. Not just from on field, but off field, and what that will look like in the locker room and on the practice field. But at the same time, though, it all comes down to what you do on Saturdays, and this is where you lay the foundation for it. So it's going to be a big couple of weeks for that group.
And getting to Keandre Lambert-Smith, I'm really curious to hear, and hopefully we'll have a chance to hear from Keandre himself here in the coming weeks, one way or another, and really pick his brain a little bit about how the discussions went with Kotelnicki, where the optimism is when you finish the season in that way. From a production standpoint, and we saw the snap counts kind of dwindle late in the season a little bit compared to where it was. What is the optimism now after talking about 2024 and what might look different? And I'm wondering how much is the slot going to be the big factor in that kind of conversation for Keandre Lambert-Smith and getting him to finish his career at the highest of notes. Julian Fleming, to me, and Trey Wallace, you like what they can provide from an outside presence. We've seen Liam Clifford, Caden Saunders, to different points, get some varied extent of run in the slot as well. But to me, just based on what we're working with here on January 17th with this receiver group, it seems to me that Keandre Lambert-Smith in the slot and not necessarily exclusively working there, but predominantly working there is maybe your key to unlocking the best of this receiver room. And, you wonder what Omari Evans, can do now in year three. And as you review the roster, all of a sudden these guys that we consider to be still kind of the new kids on the block, they got redshirt sophomore or junior next to their name. Caden Saunders, redshirt sophomore. Tyler Johnson, redshirt sophomore. Omari Evans is a junior. These guys aren't the new kids on the block anymore. And I think it's going to be really important by the time we get through spring ball and Marcus Hagans, will have a chance he's already had a chance to give feedback from year one with their end of season interviews. He can now see how that feedback has been applied, how it's been digested by this unit, and how this group exits, April 15th or whatever that date you said is the blue-white game. is going to go a long way towards, I think, the overall vibes around this offensive attack. And so Keandre Lambert-Smith and many of these others, a guy like Malik Mega, who's predominantly been used on special teams. I know he got a little bit of run at wide receiver in the Peach Bowl, but really been a special teams guy. Malik McLean, let's not forget about him, another 6'4" figure at receiver like Mega. These are older players. And then some of the younger pieces like Anthony Ivy, who I mentioned, and like a Tyler Johnson, and you got a redshirt freshman in Carmelo Taylor. It just, not everybody's going to get out of spring ball and feeling like they got a true legitimate chance to be a factor in September. So I still think we'll see movement in this room. But as you get to it, I think it's one of the surprises to me is not just that you've added a piece, we expected you'd add a piece, but that one way or another, this group is giving it another shot. Another semester, it seems. And likewise, Penn State's given another shot with this group. And really going to be compelling to follow their evolution, because it's something, a jolt was needed. And I think with Drew Aller, it's going to go a long way towards seeing a lot of familiar faces there this semester as well. And you'd imagine they're already piecing together their plan for throwing the ball away from official team events and team practices and all that. Staying on the offense before we move on to one spot on defense, at least one spot, and Tyler Calvaruso jumping in to join us in just a bit. I think the offensive line as a whole, if Juice Scruggs was the catalyst for that group a couple of years ago, you had a few options. You had an All-American left tackle, Olu Fashanu at left tackle. You had right tackle, Caden Wallace had such a big leap in his performance from year 4 to year 5 on campus. And then you had Hunter Norzad, who, consistently was one of the better centers in Big Ten football, I thought, over the course of the year after moving over from guard. All those guys have moved on. Sal Wormley is a name that remains on this roster, a guy that we were wondering about with that extra eligibility. He is a 6th-year player. He's indeed here, and he is indeed here. So, Daniel, there's some legitimate experience here, but to me, this is a new test for Phil Trautwein. The first test was, can you build this offensive lineup from where it's not a problem? Can you make it not a problem to where it's average? He did that. Can you make it to where it's average, to where it's considered kind of one of the better attributes for this team from a depth standpoint, from a starting 5 perspective? I think they accomplished that over the course of the last year. Now it's going to be, well, can you lose a bunch of pieces in one fell swoop and use that depth and use your recruiting ability and use those transfer portal pieces? Can you take another step forward this year without missing a beat? And we got a lot to learn in the next 8 months before they encounter an opposing defense, Daniel. But the pieces are all there. What it looks like, who's actually playing inside, playing outside. Can a young player emerge? Can a transfer player like Nolan Rucci come in and claim a starting job? Are there going to be 3 rotations in place come the West Virginia matchup? To me, this is a spot that I am just even more so than wide receiver, because you've got a lot of positional versatility in play, and you have a boatload of former blue chip talent waiting for their opportunity here.
It's going to be really fun to watch, I think, and I'm curious to see if we get any kind of hints from James Franklin early on with how things are going in 2022. In that spring, we heard that it was basically set it and forget it with Olu at left tackle, where James Franklin didn't really lean on his competition answer for everything. It was, pretty much like, yeah, Olu's getting all the reps at left tackle, and that was coming off of just having one start in the Outback Bowl. So I'm curious to see if we hear anything similar along those lines from James Franklin as we go through spring ball. But I think the competition for reps is going to be pretty fierce. I think that when you look at who is coming back, they don't have anyone like Olu who they're going to need to manage, who that they can kind of lighten his workload a little bit and let some other guys get those reps. I think that when you talk about Venga Ioane and JB Nelson, those are guys that you want them to get as many reps as possible. Salim Wormley, 60-year guy, that might be a little bit different because I think that you kind of know what he can do. They didn't really rotate at right guard much last year. Maybe that's the one spot where you can maybe kind of set it and forget it. But you talk about, adding Nolan Rucci to the mix. Drew Shelton is going to be someone that is probably going to be gunning to get a spot on the field. Anthony Donka kind of popped up on our radar as someone where, oh, we need to factor him in now, a little bit sooner than maybe we thought. Javen Williams is the former 5-star. Chimdi Ono is someone whose development is going to be worth tracking. And then I think that kind of a bit of a wild card is Cooper Cousins. How ready will he be when he gets here? What kind of impact might he be able to make as a true freshman? I know that I know the way that we've talked about with the lines, that you kind of built in a redshirt year when you talk about these guys coming in, just because the adjustment is so much. But we've seen Cooper Cousins at those camps. We know how much experience that he's gotten with Phil Trautwein, with Frank Leonard. We know that he has the versatility to play all across the line. I think that that's going to be a bit of a wild card this year in terms of, is there going to be a spot for him? Might they need to call on him? They just have so many options. Kind of scrolling through this list right now. Got to mention Nick Dawkins as someone who appears to be in line to compete for that center job. This line is just going to look a lot different. It's kind of it's an interesting situation because you're returning 3 guys who started games last year with Wormley, Ioane, and Nelson. But then you're also losing 3 guys who started games last year with Fashanu, Norzad, and Wallace. It's a pretty funny dynamic in terms of what you lost, what you're returning. But this group, I think you're going to have some guys kind of take a leap, really step up, try to seize some of these jobs.
Nelson's somebody that there was so much excitement about in August, and you saw flashes of that in early fall as he was the first left guard involved after Landon Tengwall's retirement. But he was banged up for a couple different patches of the season, including the final stretch. Only played a few snaps against Michigan State. I think he got in for 1 snap in the bowl matchup coming off of that injury issue. So we didn't get the full scope exactly of JB Nelson, but everything we heard behind the scenes pointed towards a big year. And then Nick Dawkins, to me, you mentioned it. Not only is he in the mix to be the starting center for this offense, but I think he could be one of the most important leadership assets for this entire offensive unit. He's somebody that was genuinely discussed as team captain material this past offseason in 2023, despite the fact that everyone knew he wasn't going to be a starter. So when you can garner that kind of respect across the locker room among the coaching staff, because they truly felt like he's a guy who was capable of carrying the captaincy if he needed to. And so to hear that about a second string player, which he was this past year, says a lot. And so if that can translate into a bigger, more vocal role, and he won't have any issues stepping up to a vocal role, I promise you that. If you listen to the podcast several years now, you heard Nick Dawkins at least 2 or 3 times on the show. A very impressive young man. But from a performance standpoint, if he can step up and be that leader, effective as a guy after the snap, but effective before the snap as well, which was something we heard so highly about Juice Scruggs, and then how Hunter Norzad stepped into that role, some of their pre-snap abilities. I think that a lot of things fall into place for you if you're Phil Trautwein, if Nick Dawkins does show up here in 2024 and through spring practices and into those early stages of summer. If you say, okay, this is our guy at center and there's not really a question there, then a lot more makes sense. If instead you're factoring in Vega Ioane, or you want to get a longer look at a Cooper Cousins, or who knows what else, then you're maybe impacting your guard depth. Maybe you're impacting other potential rotations that you could be utilizing. So Nick Dawkins, to me, is a key player. And we've addressed tackle a bunch. That is maybe the highest ceiling of any area on this roster when you talk about the assemblage of talent there. But outside of Drew Shelton and about a half of football for Anthony Donka, none of these guys have been out in the frying pan facing edge rushers off the perimeter and big-time matchups for any extended period. So fun area to watch. I think on defense, Daniel, got a new linebackers coach in Tom Allen. You say goodbye to Curtis Jacobs, but you like that you bring back a 2-time All-Big Ten performer in Abdul Carter. Tony Rojas takes another step forward. Kobe King delivered a largely impressive first year as a starter at Mike linebacker. And I think on the defensive front, as we've addressed, because of the players who've decided to return for extra years, because of the depth that they've had at defensive end, that's an area where Deion Barnes really seems to have it all figured out. Now at safety, you say goodbye to Keaton Ellis, team captain, mainstay in the locker room and special teams, not a defensive mainstay. You bring back your top 3 safeties. I think cornerback is the area where's the spotlight landing? Well, it shifts there pretty dramatically when you look over on the defensive side of things, because Terry Smith loses the top 3 performers and producers from that unit, guys who are going to play in the NFL, and Kalen King, Johnny Dixon, Daquan Hardy, guys that can play in the perimeter, play in the slot, get after the quarterback. doing different things for that defense in their own right. They've all moved on. Cam Miller is back. He'll be a junior. He's accrued quite a bit of reps, but as largely a third or fourth guy outside of the Peach Bowl. Zion Tracy, Elliott Washington burned redshirt last year as true freshman cornerbacks, but much of their work came as special teams contributors until that Peach Bowl again, when young players needed to step up. And so you've got a Davian Collins, but then you've got 4 new players who just jumped into the fray in January. 2 freshmen that are highly thought of out of Mandarin High School in Jacksonville, Florida, and Antoine Belgrave-Shorter and John Mitchell, and then 2 former SEC impact players. And I guess I can't necessarily say that in AJ Harris's case, he was an impact player, but as a true freshman, he burned red shirt in the defensive backfield with the 2-time defending champion Georgia Bulldogs. And then in the case of Kimber, he plays at not just Georgia to start his career, but then goes to Florida, starts a bunch of games. And so this is a group that when you talk about what happened in the Peach Bowl and the weeks leading up to it to where we are now in mid-January, it has transformed in a very significant way. And there are big shoes to fill, but they seem to have the components that Terry Smith wants to work with. And I think we could still view this as a high-end position group by the time they figure out the plan come next September.
It's kind of a cliche that gets used sometimes in these conversations, but it feels like Penn State, you talk about losing 3 guys to the NFL, your mind kind of goes to rebuilding a little bit in that position group. But I think with the way that things have gone, it's a lot more of a retooling there when you bring in these guys with experience from the transfer portal. We know that Cam Miller has a boatload of experience through 2 years. We know that Zion Tracy and Elliott Washington, they got their feet wet this year in a pretty big way through special teams and playing at the end of these blowouts. And then we saw the Peach Bowl. I mean, I think that they've gotten a ton of valuable experience. So I think that Penn State did a really nice job of restocking that room, both through the transfer portal for kind of the immediate impact, but then also keeping in this kind of building through the high school ranks, having a very strong foundation. When you talk about guys like Tracy and Washington, and then Antoine Belgrave-Shorter and John Mitchell, I think that Penn State has done a good job of, especially in the cornerback room, of recruiting for sustainability and then going to the portal to fill some of these holes to add some talent that you can have. And especially with AJ Harris, that's a guy who's going to be here for at least 2 years. So you have someone that you can develop a little bit. And, we saw Johnny Dixon come in as someone who had experience in the SEC. He came in and we saw what he left as. I think that, Terry Smith has shown that he can take these guys and turn them into NFL caliber players or players that you can use all over the defense. So that cornerback room it's going to be a lot of competition there. I think that some of these battles that we won't get to see too much of, but in spring practice between the wide receivers and the cornerbacks, it's going to be guys really competing, really going for their playing time. James Franklin loves to say it's the most competitive environment in college football, and I think that those 2 rooms are where you're going to see it. But that cornerback room, you lose 3 NFL guys, but you're coming back and you're like, yes, it's still pretty talented. It's really a testament to Terry Smith and company.
4 additions in the cornerback room here for the winter semester and for spring ball, and then meanwhile in that wide receiver room, just 1 addition. So you're right; those battles are going to be interesting. It's been a bit of a reset at cornerback. There are some familiar faces, and to this point, receiver room, you kind of just tack on Julian Fleming to what you finished the season with, and it's a group that we are well familiar with, and they're trying to change the narrative around. And this cornerback room is trying to say, hey, we're still here. We're not going to be a slip off kind of position concern. And so that should be a really interesting battle for 15 practice periods come spring ball. Daniel, let's finish with some basketball conversation before we get to Tyler Calvaruso. Tyler's got a little bit more perspective on these freshman enrollees, a few in particular we're going to spotlight. We're also going to get to the Junior Day recruiting event coming up in just a matter of days here in Happy Valley. But Daniel, big win Tuesday night. It was a late tip-off at the BJC, and ultimately Penn State goes toe-to-toe with number 11 Wisconsin. It's a back-and-forth battle late. They withstand it, and they come away with the victory that sends fans dashing onto the court. As Mark Brennan wrote about in his top takes late on Tuesday night, it was a validated court rush for Penn State. And since we really did a bit of a progress report on the team a couple weeks ago, it has been up and down. A close loss to Northwestern, followed by a blowout loss against Purdue, and then a matchup here where you wouldn't have been surprised if another blowout developed. And instead, Penn State picks up the win. They're 9-9 now on the season, one game below 500 in Big Ten play. The floor is yours here, sir. What are we making of this performance for Penn State? And what are you learning about the Nittany Lions as Big Ten conference action really gets into the meat, the nitty-gritty of it all?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, it was a really, really fun basketball game last night at the Bryce Jordan Center. I think that, going into it, me and Mark were talking where it was a 9 p.m. tip. There was a snow day. The weather in Happy Valley yesterday was pretty tough in the morning. So classes got canceled. People that maybe might make the drive in, already probably weren't thinking about it because of the 9 p.m. tip. And then you had the weather on top of it. And, we thought that there was the potential for the BJC to be really, really dead last night. Everyone knows kind of what that building can be like on certain days and certain situations. But, you have to give a ton of credit to Mike Rhodes and the BJC and the administration for adjusting on the fly. I mean, you get the announcement yesterday afternoon that students can get in free with their IDs. Then later on, you get the announcement of discounted chicken baskets, and I think kind of putting it out there. Mark had a good line in his top takes where you don't know how the students were spending their snow day, what they were doing in those hours leading up to 9 p.m. But the end result was a group that was pretty juiced up. I mean, I think that they announced an attendance of 8,000 people. I think that maybe 60% of that, 70% of that could have been students, based on how they filled up the student section, and then people just scattered around the lower bowl. I mean, it ended up being a really fun environment. It was a really fun game. I think that you look at Penn State's, some of their other big wins this year. You had the big comeback against Ohio State, and you had a comeback against Michigan at the Plestra. I mean, but this game was, they jumped out early and they held. They didn't have to, erase this huge deficit. Even though they gave up the lead, it became a tie game. It never felt like they actually collapsed. It just kind of ended up being a heavyweight fight with guys going back and forth, and Penn State just never blinked. Kanye Clary scored 27, Ace Baldwin had 20, Nick Kern had 15. You saw a really balanced effort. You had a guy like Demetrius Lilly, who's barely played this year, come off the bench, play 19 minutes, and give you really good energy down low. You kind of saw a total team performance, which we haven't really seen too many times this year. So it was just a fun basketball game. I mean, 87-83, a ton of points, a ton of action. Both teams shot the ball really well in the second half. And I think that it's kind of it's the type of game where you feel like something is being built. You kind of see what Mike Rhodes' vision is a little bit. You see the work that he's done in terms of trying to connect, with the community and with the students, and trying to get people to come out to the games. I think that you kind of saw that work, yield results yesterday in terms of the number of students who were there, in terms of that kind of crowd that you got on, that type of day. It was just kind of we'll see. I mean, they can turn around and lose to Ohio State on Saturday, and some of it goes out the window a little bit, but I think that you were kind of starting to see some of this work that Rhodes has put in yield results. You've seen these players develop over the course of the season. I think that it's a win that you come away from it and you just feel really good about it. If you're Penn State. So it was super fun. I think, one of the writers from the Daily Collegian, Max Ralph, he had a kind of funny tweet that I saw this morning where, it was like 10:30 last night. I was pretty tired. I had that cup of coffee, but when you're in the game, you kind of looked up at the time and you're like, oh, this doesn't feel like 10:30. This doesn't feel like 10:45. It was really that type of game. So, in terms of what we were expecting and what we got, it was just pretty cool. And it was just kind of fun game, not something you see every week. And I think that Penn State, can use this as a building block moving forward.
Penn State only plays 2 games in the next 2 weeks, both of them Saturday Big Ten matchups. They're at Ohio State this Saturday, then they're home against Minnesota next Saturday, and we'll see if this serves as a springboard, but we are expecting more of a roller coaster experience for Penn State and Big Ten basketball play, right, Daniel?
Oh yeah, it's you look at Ken Palm, and there's some 50% games coming up, and it's the Big Ten it's a weird league this year. I think that you've got 3 teams that I labeled publicly as potentially finishing in the bottom 4 and playing on that Wednesday. Have big wins in the past 3 days, with Maryland beating Illinois, Michigan beating Ohio State, and Penn State beating Wisconsin. So I think that it's shaping up to be anyone can beat anyone at any time. And I think if you're Penn State, if you have the chance to jump on someone, you really got to take advantage.
Good stuff. Daniel and Mark Brennan both have coverage up from Tuesday night's Penn State basketball action. They have Penn State basketball covered throughout the season, and obviously a bunch going on regarding the football program right now from Daniel over at Lions247.com. Appreciate the conversation we're going to get into with Tyler Calvaruso now, but I'll catch up with you real soon.
Thanks, Tyler. Stay warm today.
All right, you too. Let's get over to Tyler Calvaruso as promised, and he's been standing by with us. Tyler, good to see you. We just spent a bunch of time sorting through and catching up a bit, some staff movement, the dust settling with roster movement. We're going to continue that with you a bit, and we're also going to look forward with some recruiting coverage because a big event coming to Happy Valley this weekend. First and foremost, how you doing?
I'm doing well, man. Hope you guys are holding up all right there with the weather and everything.
We're good, man. We signed up for it. I would say it's Big Ten weather, but now we've got Los Angeles as part of that conversation. So I guess I can't use that phrase anymore. But yeah, we're in the thick of it with winter, and yet Penn State keep things pretty hot in terms of what we're covering over at Lions247.com. You got a lot of coverage going on right now for the Junior Day event. They are building quite a guest list. The first of those is this Saturday. You and I are going to break down some of those early names to know. A bunch more coverage over at Lions247.com for VIP subscribers. But I want to pick up on a bit of the discussion that Daniel and I just had about now that these guys are here, now that they're getting settled into campus life and life as a Nittany Lion, what do we make of some of these additions? And I think we've kind of put a large focus on some of the 5-6 top names in this recruiting class since signing day, which is understandable because they're highly rated and we think they're going to be really good Nittany Lions players. But there's a few others that I know we wanted to circle back here with you. Brian Doan did a great job last week going player by player with this early enrollment class just about, and giving us a lot of background and a lot of context. And I know that you're going to add to that here with a few different names, and one of which is kind of played second fiddle, I guess you could say, on his own defensive line in Penn State's recruiting class, because he shared it with Jalen Harvey down at Quince Orchard and Xavier Gilliam, a guy who made his moves as a basketball athlete early in the high school career when he was playing for Wild Lake in Columbia, Maryland. He ends up finishing his career at Quince Orchard, which is more of a high-profile football program, and he looks every bit the part as a senior. He's going to be playing inside for the Nittany Lions. And what do you want to get to here with Xavier Gilliam, who is here on campus among those 16 early enrolled freshmen?
I think he's a guy who deserves a lot more love and attention than he's probably gotten publicly. He committed early. He committed in June. He was part of that big group of commits that decided to wrap things up during June official visit season. His official visit took place during the first weekend of June, and he was among the first to pop coming out of that weekend. I remember, early in his high school career, like you said, he really made his name on the hardwood. He was always, really solid on the football field as well, playing defensive end a lot. So there were early questions about, where would he project at the next level and what could he do at the next level on the defensive line. I think, that versatility, he could play inside and on the edge. That versatility is a nice, little aspect of his game. And really, there's a lot of excitement about Gilliam internally and what he's going to be able to accomplish at Penn State. They think he's a guy who takes really well to coaching, to be able to get to work with Deion Barnes and really come along nicely in his development, maybe quicker than some people, are anticipating. His motor has been praised by multiple people. He's just really good kid who, now that he's in town, is going to be, looking to make an impact early, one of many who's going to be looking to make an impact early. So Xavier Gilliam is definitely one of the few guys I'm keeping a really close eye on now that they're officially on campus enrolled, getting rolling with classes, getting rolling in the offseason program. I think we'll be talking about him a lot more moving forward than we did during his recruitment. I think he's one of those guys who could definitely surprise some people moving forward. And again, maybe earlier than some people anticipate.
I know his raw athleticism as he was, transitioning from a basketball kind of guy to a Power 5, genuine Power 5 football prospect stood out to Penn State. And the athleticism was a foundation of a lot of that Power 5 recruitment process. But I think what really stood out in conversations with Nittany Lions coaches was that he is like in the 280-pound range at 6'2", but he doesn't look like that. This is a situation where much like Zane Duran, I think is what the comparisons that I've heard in terms of somebody who had success coming to campus as maybe you could label him a bit of a tweener prospect, but bought into defensive tackle, did what was necessary from a nutritional standpoint, followed that path, and he ends up being a starter for you by year 2 at defensive tackle. Now, is Xavier Gilliam in position to be a starter by year 2? That's a lot to project right now, but I think that they see similarities right there and how they laid things out with Durant and what may be available for Gilliam, who as a senior playing alongside Chop Robinson went for 15 tackles for loss and 6 sacks, was a first-team All-Metro selection. Let's get to another one of those defensive linemen from the DMV out of Friendship Collegiate Academy in Washington, D.C., DeAndre Cook. And I know this is somebody that you want to talk about trying to figure out where's the fit as a defensive end, as a defensive tackle. This is one that I think Penn State takes a lot of pride in because they evaluated just about earlier than anybody else on the Power 5 scene that interior was where that highest ceiling was in place. And Cook embraced that. And as word got around, by the way, that other teams started to gravitate towards him being a defensive tackle on the recruiting trail. But Penn State had a head start in that regard. This is a guy who closed out his senior season with 3 sacks in a state championship. He was the game MVP. He had 10 sacks as a senior. Despite the fact that he was banged up with an injury for much of the year. I was told a high ankle sprain was impacting him, and yet puts together a really dominant finish to his senior season. And he's somebody that comes to campus, and so much of what you have gathered on from him has occurred as a defensive end. You start to project those measurables. You start to project his style of play to the interior. And man, they didn't lose anything at defensive tackle coming out of the 2023 season. They got guys coming back for extra years, and yet the bottom of the depth chart, I feel like, is continuing to get in a better and better place. And this is a position room that is pretty stocked up with DeAndre Cook as being a part of that process now.
Yeah, Deion Barnes has done a nice job building up the depth, specifically on the interior of the defensive line. You just mentioned it with everyone coming back. You're welcoming a pretty impressive group of interior defensive linemen to campus in this 2024 class. DeAndre Cook among them. He's another guy who played second fiddle on his own defensive line in high school. Friendship had Dylan Stewart, the elite South Carolina signee playing defensive end. So Cook might have been taking a backseat to him, but his production kind of spoke for itself. He might be a little bit longer term of a projection than Xavier Gilliam. He kind of reminds me of Ty Blanding from the 2023 class. If you go look at it measurably wise, Ty Blanding coming out of Christ the King in New York was 6'3", 275. DeAndre Cook, I believe, is around 6'4", 260, 270. I think he's added some good weight. So they're similar in terms of their measurables. And I think, like Blanding, he's a guy who could probably, use a year or two to get acclimated to everything. But I think he's got a pretty high ceiling to him. I think that the staff, that was something that they recognized relatively early. And I like the projection on the interior. I think he does have the potential to be an impact guy on the interior in the Big Ten. It might not happen quickly. He might have to, put in some more work in the weight room and things of that nature. But Penn State's excited about his potential as well. So down the road, DeAndre Cook could definitely be a guy for Deion Barnes in his interior defensive line rotation.
Cook announced at 6'4", 270 on signing day. And I told Tyler when we were getting ready for this episode, send me like 5 names from this early enrollment group that you think maybe we didn't hit on enough the first couple of weeks of the month or coming out of signing day and things are getting settled in with this group. And you went heavy on defensive line. You went 4 defensive linemen. We're through 2 of them. We'll go to the guy who was a top-ranked defender in this entire class, was initially offered as an offensive lineman, and that's Liam Andrews. I know Brian Doan, when he came on the last episode, spoke so highly about what Andrews could offer as an offensive lineman. He was calling him maybe a potential first-round pick projection someday as an offensive lineman. Maybe we have more to learn about him as a defensive lineman, but Penn State, I know the defensive staff had no qualms with taking the baton in this recruitment process. There was a bit of a transition period where you've got to get Deion Barnes up to speed on Liam Andrews and Liam Andrews up to speed on Deion Barnes, but we're well past the recruitment process now. Let's talk about the prospect that Penn State added and why you wanted to include him in this conversation.
Yeah, going back to when Liam Andrews committed to Penn State in July, he kind of struck me as one of those guys, given his upside and, just his entire makeup as a recruit. We saw him when he was an offensive line prospect primarily, and he was dominant. And, word is he has the same sort of dominant potential on the defensive side of the ball. I do think we need to learn more about him on that side of the ball, and he's working his way back from shoulder surgery. But I do think that, he wouldn't be one of those guys if he pushed for playing time early. It's going to be tough given the depth chart and the experience that does return now on the interior. But if he's one of those guys who, his talent kind of forces his way into the conversation, it wouldn't surprise me. It's probably more of a, 2025 thing in that regard now that, he's working his way back from injury and Penn State is in a good place on the interior of its defensive line in terms of numbers and experience. But I really like Liam Andrews' upside. I mean, he's a top 24/7, solidified top 24/7 guy really throughout the cycle. And I think once he gets comfortable playing on the interior of a Big Ten defensive line, I think the toughness that he played with as an offensive lineman definitely carries over to the defensive side of the ball. That's another thing. We talked about Cooper Cousins a lot and his toughness that we saw out of him on the camp circuit. And when you could see that out of a lineman, it speaks volumes because the pads aren't even on. Liam Andrews had a similar kind of fire and toughness, and just every rep he was locked in and giving it 110%. And I think he brings that to the defensive side of the ball as well. So that's something the Penn State staff is going to like to coach up. And as he goes on in his development, he's another one who I think can be a guy for Barnes on his interior rotation moving forward.
And at 6'4", 260 pounds, I think when he gets in some space, he starts to move like a linebacker. This is a suddenness to his movement at that size. And he's somebody that I think when we get a chance to see maybe in the weight room in January, when they let us in there, usually in February, when we get a chance to do that in February of 2025, he could look so different than the guy who signed with Penn State. And I just think that he's kind of got that skyrocket possibility in terms of his conditioning and physicality as that could grow here at Penn State. But I know they think he can be really special for them on the interior. And what really stands out to the staff is a level of urgency that Liam Andrews seems to bring to his football career. That is certainly present for the 60 minutes of action that occur on the field when the whistle is blown. But I think generally day to day, he is a guy who understands the big picture and has done a lot for himself to set up for this moment at Penn State. The last guy you had listed here for the defensive line, and he's arguably the wild card of this class. And Brian Doan laid things out a bit as well here in this case with T.A. Cunningham, who was very early on the national kind of conversation about the 2024 recruiting class several years ago, and did some really impressive things on the field early on in his high school career, but largely kind of known nationally, I would say, as a guy who spent a lot of time transferring, made some marquee transfer movement, but didn't play a lot of football along the way. And so here he is. He already put out a tweet about how he's excited about all the assets and tools at his disposal here at Penn State. One of the big things that we heard coming out of signing day was Penn State feels like when they got T.A. Cunningham in their clutches, I guess you could say, and got him here on campus, that they just felt like he was going to take to the culture and that they were going to have an opportunity to come away with a real steal of a prospect here. As we talked about, you're discussing a guy who was projected as a top 50 to top 100 prospect early on in his career. He's physically one of the bigger defensive linemen on your roster as soon as he steps foot in the door. And you've got 4 years to figure out if this is a fit, starting here with year one, which to me, based on everything that has led up to his enrollment, year one is going a long way in determining what the college career trajectory is for this young man.
That tweet that you mentioned is actually the exact reason I wanted to talk about him today. We've talked about T.A. Cunningham a bunch, probably more than any other guy that we just referenced. He's come up in conversation quite frequently, but I think that tweet kind of speaks volumes for those who missed it or either aren't into social media or anything like that. He posted on January 11th, shortly after enrollment. He posted, "Thank you, Jesus, for the athletic resources and support staff I have access to. Amen. And really, T.A. Cunningham, we've talked a lot about his high school career and how he moved around a lot and there wasn't a lot of stability, and how moving forward we thought that him getting in an environment that was significantly more stable and structured would be big for him. And I think that post, and I think he's kind of already realizing what it is going to mean for him to be in that kind of structured environment now, where he can be a creature of habit and just focus on football and doing what he needs to do on and off the field and in the classroom. I think that when T.A. Cunningham is locked in, like I foresee him being now that he has that structure and comfort and doesn't have to worry about, what school he's going to be playing for next or anything like that, what state he's going to be living in. I think he has as much ability as any defensive lineman in Penn State's 2024 recruiting class. So I'm really excited to see where his development takes him. I definitely agree with the assessment that year one will be big as well, probably as much mentally as physically. He already has a Big Ten body. We've known that really for months, that he was equipped to play in the Big Ten physically. Mentally, how does he adjust to the rigors of a college football program? How does he adjust to the physicality of playing on the interior of a Big Ten defensive line? I think he'll be able to get going in that regard, but that'll be a very, very interesting factor to monitor when it comes to T.A. Cunningham. But really excited to see where his development takes him because, again, I think he's got as much upside and talent as any defensive lineman Penn State signed in December.
His mom and dad were college basketball players. He's 6'5", 285 pounds, according to Penn State's initial listing for Cunningham, and someone we'll be tracking closely. Curious to hear about how it's going for him through this first semester before they even get to the field in March. And then I think you hit it on the head here with your fifth name, which is going to keep us in the trenches but get us over to offense. This is probably the least discussed prospect in this class, in my opinion, because of the guys who are at the top of the position board within the class, and because of just what is going on with ratings and rankings. And so he's a 3-star, and he's Egan Boyer out of Cornelius, North Carolina, a player that committed to Penn State along with a lot of other players in a bit of a spree, late spring, early summer time frame. 3-time Letterman down there, big-time performer for a conference championship team as a senior. And yet we've got names like Garrett Sexton and Cooper Cousins and Donnie Harbor that carry larger ratings and rankings. And we've got a tackle position that we're already pretty fixated on younger components like former 5-star Javen Williams and former top 24/7 prospect Chim Diono, and now another former 5-star entering the mix and Nolan Rucci. And yet you've got Egan Boyer here and saying, let's get to him a little bit. What do you want to discuss about a guy who also enrolled, and as I said, did so really under the radar compared to so many other components? He is also 6'8", 250 pounds, which is a very unique measurement for any offensive lineman you'll see across college football, and one that we can certainly confirm. Not a lot of guys look like Egan Boyer at Penn State prospect camps in the last several years that I've covered. And Phil Trautwein absolutely, is going to be flexing if 3 or 4 years down the road, this young man turns out to be a bona fide Big Ten offensive lineman.
It's kind of like the Xavier Gilliam of the offensive side of the ball when you think about it in terms of lack of attention and, him coming up in conversation. He hasn't been a guy we've talked about a lot since he committed. But really, it was really important, I'd say, for Egan Boyer to be an early enrollee because you mentioned the 6'8", 250. And he's got a ton of upside with that frame, but it's key for him to get in the weight room and get to work with Chuck Losey. And him being at Penn State in January, that helps him a great deal when it comes to his physical development moving forward. Upside and frame was a big reason why Penn State took Egan Boyer and was so interested in him throughout his recruitment, kind of like Garrett Sexton. You project, if you're Phil Trautwein, what you could do with these guys when you get them coached up and when they grow into their frames. Egan Boyer has a frame where he could add a lot more weight, and it'll be good weight, and it won't strip him of any of the athleticism that makes him an intriguing offensive line prospect. At least that is the hope, right? You hope that he adds some pounds and, his athleticism as a pass protector at tackle remains intact. And I think Penn State is confident that he'll be able to accomplish that physical development. So Boyer in town, already at work in the weight room and everything like that. So it's another development that's going to be very intriguing to follow because, again, if you hit on a guy who is 6'8" and athletic and can do a lot of different things for you at tackle, You're talking about a guy who maybe has, NFL draft potential. The NFL loves guys with frames like that. So we got to see where Boyer's physical development takes him. On field, his tape is solid. So I think he definitely, the skill set is there. It's going to come down to the physical side of things for him.
He's a 3-star, 46 tackle overall in 24/7 Sports rankings, and so when you include him in a conversation where you've got guys like Rucci, Drew Shelton, Anthony Donka, Javen Williams, Chimdi Ono, Alex Birchmeyer, Garrett Sexton, Cooper Cousins, who've preceded him to campus. Well, actually, Rucci didn't. He got to campus around the same time, but those are all 5-star guys. 4-star guys. So one of the least talked about members of this class, and maybe one of the least talked about offensive linemen that have been brought in under the watch of Phil Trautwein in recent years. And as we said, a bit of a fascinating case study in the coming years to see where it goes for the 250-pounder at 6'8". I will say this: he's already got that violent nature in place. We saw some of that on the prospect camp. I think that's very much evidenced by his senior season of film. So you don't have to figure out how to make a guy bigger and more angry. I think he's a guy who already plays football angry, and now you try to equip him with the physical tools to be able to do that against Power 5 defenders on a daily basis. Appreciate the perspective, Tyler, as we worked our way through those names. And I know we want to jump in to finish off this episode with some Junior Day coverage, and there's been plenty of it over at Lions247.com as you've been confirming names, and we've got others contributing to that as well. Brian Doan, Alan True, Steve Wiltfong have been helping with updates about who's heading to Happy Valley this weekend and some upcoming opportunities this winter. But Tyler, keeping the focus on Saturday's Junior Day event, we've got a few guys to talk about. And why don't we get right to it with a legacy that has been an interest for the Nittany Lions and Nittany Lions fans for quite some time now, but he is not someone we've seen around campus very often.
Yep, Anthony Sacca will be back in town for the first time since October 2022. That was the whiteout against Minnesota.
Long time.
Yeah, for those who don't remember what the significance of that day was, that was the whiteout win over Minnesota, and that was the last time Anthony Sacca was in town. He was looking to get back to campus during the fall. His schedule didn't really align. He did make some other visits during the fall. I actually got to see Penn State play when he visited Ohio State in October, and he was when the Fighting Irish hosted Ohio State in September. And I mentioned those visits specifically because I'd say those are the three teams, most firmly in the mix for Anthony Sacca right now. Michigan is there as well, but Ohio State, Notre Dame, and Penn State are the three standing out right now, I'd say. I've heard some good things about where Penn State is at with Anthony Sacca. I mean, I've had the chance to talk to him, and Penn State remains a program that he is planning on taking an official visit to when the time comes. But, it's a tough race between Ohio State, Notre Dame, and Penn State right now. The Nittany Lions are fighting the fight, and this is a big opportunity for the staff getting him back to town this weekend. It's been a while. The relationships are pretty good. They've always been pretty good, but it's important to get him back to campus, and that's what Penn State is doing this weekend.
Sacca is number 25 in linebacker ratings at 24/7 Sports. He's inside the top 24/7 at number 215. Overall, the number 6 player in the state of Pennsylvania at the Philadelphia powerhouse St. Joe's Prep. And a guy that we saw attend Penn State camp back in 2022. I don't believe he participated, but he was just there, and he seemed to have a great relationship with a lot of the coaches out there, just chatting on the field, and a specimen to be sure. But it has been a while since he's been on campus, as you just covered. And so we'll see if some things can be accelerated a bit between the two parties as he gets back to town, has a chance to share rooms with coaches and fellow prospects. Another in-state component of the plans for Saturday, Alex Taish, linebacker out of Latrobe here in Pennsylvania, 6'2", 211 pounds. Does not yet have a rating or ranking from Lions 24/7 or 24/7 Sports, I should say. But Penn State is among several Power 5 offers to this point: Boston College, Cincinnati, Duke, Maryland, Pittsburgh, South Carolina, Stanford, Syracuse, Southern Cal, Virginia Tech, West Virginia, and Wisconsin are among schools that see a potential fit with Alex Taish. What are you hearing regarding the in-state linebacker? And as we said, when he was initially offered, whenever the Nittany Lions determine they want to target someone at this position in the state of Pennsylvania, you should be paying close attention to the situation.
Yeah, Penn State's the crystal ball favorite right now, and I'll probably join in there with a prediction at some point here soon based on the way this one has been trending. I think going back to last month, I mentioned him as a guy who I'd be surprised if he didn't wind up at Penn State. So I think that kind of speaks to where this one's been heading. Him getting back to campus this weekend, it's significant. He's visited Penn State more than anywhere in his recruitment. He's got the offer. Penn State is essentially his leader ahead of this visit. So is this a situation where, maybe the Nittany Lions are able to seal the deal with a top in-state target? It's possible. We've seen these junior days net commitments in the past, whether it be immediately or, the residual effect down the road. The Nittany Lions are able to seal the deal with the guy, due in large part to what he experienced and, his interactions with the staff during the junior day experience. But Casey's a guy Penn State has liked for an extended period of time, and he has liked Penn State for an extended period of time. The interest is very much mutual, and I think the Nittany Lions are in a good spot to get this one done sooner rather than later.
Staying in state for another name here and going back to Philadelphia, and in particular, we're going to Emotep Institute. Jabri Wallace-Coleman, 2025 running back prospect, spent some time committed to the Georgia Bulldogs, which is obviously going to get your attention. He's coming back to campus this Saturday. He's also visiting a school that has 2 commits at running back in the 2025 class. So what do we make of how things are shaping up from Wallace Coleman's perspective and as he moves forward from that Georgia commitment, and then from J1 Sider and Penn State's perspective as they've already got a couple guys on board at running back for that next cycle?
Let's start with what Penn State already has on board. Staff's really high on what Tyke Hayes and Keandre Barker bring to the table, right? But this is recruiting, and, staff's going to stay on guys at positions because, one, you don't know what's going to happen with a guy like Keandre Barker who's committed to Texas. Now, granted, he's remained very locked in with Penn State since his commitment. He hasn't even really given other schools much attention or consideration, and he's gotten some solid offers. Oregon was one of them. I believe Auburn offered. So he's, received some pretty intriguing outside interest, and he's remained pretty locked in with Penn State, not even really giving those schools a second look. Will that remain the case? Again, you just don't know because it's recruiting, and he's an out-of-state guy, an out-of-region guy at that. You just gotta, sometimes you gotta continue to recruit positions for that reason. The other side of that is, Penn State is never going to turn down the opportunity to add talent it feels is, very, very good. And it's not going to turn away guys' evaluations they love. So we're going to have to see where things go with Wallace Coleman. He's an Imhotep guy, so that's notable. He was committed to Georgia. Really that decision, back off his commitment to the Bulldogs. Fran Brown played a really big part in Jabri Wallace Coleman's recruitment. Obviously, he is at Syracuse now as the head coach, so I think he wants to get a second look at things. But, Penn State, you never want to shut the door on guys that you like. I think he's one of them. Alvin Henderson is another one, top 24/7 running back for Alabama, who's going to be on campus this weekend. Henderson probably factors more into that, elite evaluation conversation than Wallace Coleman. But Penn State has maintained contact with running backs, and, those are 2 of them. And they're going to be in town this weekend. So we're going to have to see what comes of that.
Another name to finish things off here for this episode. And by the way, there are a lot more names and context about this junior day over at Lions247.com for our VIP subscribers. We have a 30% new subscriber deal going on right now if you want to take a peek at what's cooking at Lions247.com leading up to these recruiting weekends. But we got really familiar with KJ Winston during his sophomore year in 2023. Took a hold of that starting safety position next to Jalen Reed and really ran with it. A guy that I think next year is going to be on the All Big Ten radar, on a lot of NFL teams' radar as a junior. And his younger cousin, Kanoa Winston, is on just about everybody's radar at the Power 5 level. He is the number 2 safety in the country in 24/7 sports assessment at Gonzaga High School down in Washington, D.C. He is number 27 overall in our top 24/7 for the 2025 class. And he's a guy that has been back to Penn State a few different times. We like the momentum that has been in place leading up to this point. Look, he's got about 30 offers on the table right now, Tyler, but it feels like Penn State's got another chance to push things forward here with one of the most coveted defensive backs in the country.
Yeah, it's definitely another chance for Penn State to kind of separate itself from the field and, solidify its status as Kanoa Winston's leader. And, Penn State loves this kid. The skill set is elite. They're plenty familiar with him, with KJ already on board. They're familiar with the family, very familiar with Kanoa at this point in his recruitment. The relationship that are in place there, between him and the staff are really, really good. I don't think, he's necessarily in a rush to get things done. Ohio State's in the picture now. I believe he's looking to make it out to Columbus for a visit at some point. He visited North Carolina last weekend. So I don't think Winston's, in a hurry to get his recruitment done, but Penn State has accomplished a lot with him early on, and I anticipate this one continue to head in a good direction for the Nittany Lions this weekend.
And by the way, a very accomplished sprinter in the track and field scene is Winston, a guy who holds Gonzaga's school record for the 200-meter dash at 21.58 seconds. And Gonzaga is one of those schools that has Division I caliber college athlete prospects all over the campus down there in all sorts of sports. So big-time talent making his way. Any final words? And maybe we'll get you back on at the end of this week to add some more final words. But if we don't, on this Junior Day event, which shapes up to be a significant one and the first real recruiting opportunity of 2024, as we see Penn State start to get settled in with new staff members and perhaps some new approaches as they refine their strategy year by year.
Yeah, a couple things. I mean, this is going to be the first full Junior Day slate for Deion Barnes, Marcus Hagans, and Tom Allen now. So, players or recruits are going to get to know those guys a little bit better. And it's just, these 3 Junior Days, they always represent opportunities for Penn State, whether it be opportunities to close on guys, opportunity to continue building relationships, opportunities to get relationships off the ground. Some of these guys who are going to be visiting Penn State this weekend will be visiting Penn State for the first time. I mentioned Henderson. It's going to be his first trip to State College, and he's a Southern kid. So, how do you build that relationship while he's in town? Things like that you're always keeping an eye out for during these Junior Day visits. You keep an eye on, is anyone on commit watch? How are things unfolding with guys as they're on campus? So, you got to keep the ear to the ground, see what's going on. But this weekend, already a really, really good visitors list. I mean, we've been confirming names for the 27th and the 3rd, February 3rd as well. And it's just looking like it's going to be a star-studded winter for Penn State on the visit front. And it all starts this weekend. And, the list keeps on growing. So I'd anticipate before Saturday afternoon rolls around and these guys are making it out to Happy Valley, I think we're going to add some more names who are pretty intriguing targets for the Nittany Lions.
Yeah, back-to-back weekends here where Penn State's welcoming recruits to town. I'll throw another new coach in the mix, Andy Kotelnicki, the offensive coordinator. Yeah. It's also his first chance to flex his personality a little bit, go face-to-face with prospects and their families, and not just commitment watch. You're on offer watch with these weekends because if Penn State maybe just wants to fill in a little bit more of the picture with the guy, they can accomplish some of that stuff when they get them on campus, and you may see new offers go out of each of these events as that board continues to come together for 2025, and you've got 2026 prospects in play with some of this stuff as well. Tyler, appreciate the lowdown on the latest with Penn State's upcoming recruiting event and a little bit more perspective on the freshman class that we've really had a chance to dive into here in the last few episodes of the podcast. Off season is underway, but as you know, there's not a lot off about it. So we appreciate all the work you put in.
Thanks, man. Appreciate you having me back on.
All right, dude. We'll talk to him real soon. We'll talk to Daniel Gallen again soon on the podcast. For now, big thanks to both of them for hopping on. We had a lot to catch up on with. We were trying to get an episode to you a little bit earlier this week, but with the snowstorm, my personal travel plans got mixed up a little bit. So we came to you on a Wednesday. Try to get a second episode out to you later this week. And we'll try to get another guest on for you. If you missed it, last episode, Brian Doan did a great thorough breakdown of not just the 2024 freshman class that recently arrived on campus here in Happy Valley, but of some of the higher profile members of that transfer class, guys that he covered back in high school very closely, like Julian Fleming and Nolan Rucci. So just want to encourage folks, if you skip past for whatever reason our last episode, it's worth a listen to check out what Brian had to say about a lot of these guys. For now, stepping aside, I'm Tyler Donahue. This has been the Lions 247 Podcast.